They didn't see the boy. They saw the shoes, the cracked soles, the frayed laces, the torn canvas revealing mismatched socks beneath. In the grand hush of the church pews, where polished shoes tapped marble floors and iron shirts rustled like prayers, Elijah Carter sat small and silent, and they whispered, not prayers, but pity, disgust, mockery, because all they saw was a boy in shoes not worthy of God's house. But what they didn't see was everything else. Elijah had been awake since dawn. Again. He had dusted the hallway, folded the sheets, cooked breakfast for 3 people who never once said thank you. He ironed Kyle's shirt, prepared Aunt April's purse, then waited for his turn in the bathroom until the hot water ran out. His own shirt. 2 sizes too big, Kyle's old one. His pants hemmed with safety pins, the shoes thrown out weeks ago by Kyle himself. They stink, Kyle had said, tossing them into the trash can. Elijah had fished them out that night because they were all he had. It had been like this since the accident. When the car spun on wet pavement, taking both his mother and father in a flash of shattered glass and silence, Elijah was sent to live with Aunt April in Lubbock. She had agreed reluctantly. Her voice had cracked through the phone. Fine, he can stay, but don't expect me to raise him like my own. And she meant it. Kyle, her biological son, still got Christmas presents, still got dessert. Elijah got lectures about gratitude every time he sat at the dinner table. Be grateful you even have a roof over your head. Aunt April would snap, not even looking up from her wine glass, so Elijah said nothing. Always, at school, Elijah blended into walls, quiet, kept to himself. His eyes, a strange blue-gray like a storm that never arrived, were always cast downward. He wasn't out, not in a town like this. Lubbock didn't smile kindly on boys who looked soft, walked softly, or loved softly, so Elijah hid even deeper. The only place he felt remotely safe was the public library, where he could use Wi-Fi for 20 minutes at a time, sometimes longer if the clerk wasn't watching. That's where he wrote, late into the evenings, words he'd never dare say aloud, not even to God. But Sundays didn't let him hide. Sundays were for church, for pretending, for Aunt April to display her family like a trophy, one polished, one tarnished. Kyle wore a tailored vest and gelled hair. Aunt April wore lipstick Elijah had once found under a pew and handed back to her like a fool. Elijah was the accessory she couldn't hide. So she dressed him in Kyle's discards and sat him behind the organ, like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed out in time. This morning had been no different, except the whispers were louder. Kyle sat with the youth choir, elbowing his friends and laughing behind perfect teeth. Elijah sat alone, 4 pews back, his shoes squeaked with every shuffle. Someone behind him giggled. He didn't turn around. Then came the sermon. The head pastor, Reverend Tomlin, stood at the pulpit with his usual gravitas. The church fell into a respectful stillness. He began to speak on humility, on worth, on the unseen value of those the world forgets. But halfway through a sentence, he paused, looked past the choir, past the pews, his finger lifted, and pointed directly at Elijah. You, the boy with the torn shoes, come up here. The air froze. Elijah did not breathe. Aunt April's hand clenched the velvet of her purse. Kyle smirked, almost thrilled. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then came the snickering. But Elijah stood, 1 foot, then the next, each step loud against the marble. He walked past every face that had looked away, every mouth that had once said nothing when they saw the bruises under his collar or the limp in his walk. He walked to the front, shoes creaking with betrayal. The Reverend didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply said, "What's your name?" "Son Elijah Carter," the boy whispered. "And do you believe your worth is measured by your shoes?" Elijah didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat tightened. His chest rose and fell like waves. But the question wasn't meant for an answer. It was meant for the room, for the eyes that were just now beginning to see. Because sometimes the greatest sermons are preached not in words but in silence and in courage. If this story already touches you, subscribe to Heart Story for more powerful, true-to-life tales of quiet strength and unseen triumph. Part 2 continues Elijah's journey in ways no one in that church could have ever predicted. The walk back to his seat felt longer than the aisle itself. Elijah lowered his head, but the sting in his ears wasn't from shame. It was from the whispers that returned the moment he turned his back to the pulpit. Not everyone heard what the Reverend meant. Some only saw what they wanted, a charity case being pitied, not a child being lifted. He slid quietly into the wooden pew, the same place he had always sat. Aunt April's arms were folded tight, her mouth pressed into a flat line. Kyle didn't even glance his way, but the boy next to Kyle smirked and mouthed something cruel. Elijah didn't need to hear the words to feel them. They always hit the same after service. Families lingered in the foyer, shaking hands and complimenting the sermon as if nothing happened. Aunt April marched ahead with Kyle, leaving Elijah to trail behind like a shadow. Outside, the Texas heat bounced off the pavement. The soles of his torn sneakers stuck to the ground as he walked across the church parking lot. He could feel the rubber peeling further with every step. Back home, the mood turned sharp. Aunt April slammed a pot onto the stove and turned to him, eyes narrow. "What was that stunt?" she snapped. Elijah blinked. "At church?" she clarified. "You embarrassed us?" He wanted to say he hadn't done anything, that the Reverend had called on him unprompted, but he knew better. In this house, the truth didn't matter. Only appearances did. "I didn't ask for it," he murmured. "You didn't stop it either," she spat. Kyle snickered from the hallway. Elijah said nothing. He quietly walked to his room, if it could be called that. A storage space in the back of the house, with a thin mattress, one lamp, and a crooked window that let in more dust than air. On the wall, he had taped pages from old magazines, words that inspired him. Quotes he didn't fully understand but wanted to believe. He stared at the one that read, "You are not the worst things someone has said about you." That evening, Kyle strutted around in his basketball jersey, humming loud and careless. Elijah watched from the kitchen as he tossed his new shoes by the door, fresh out of the box. Aunt April beamed. She had bought them for Kyle's tournament. Not once had she looked at Elijah's feet. He knew better than to ask for anything. The last time he had dared to mention needing a school bag, Aunt April told him to use his brain, not his back. So Elijah did. Late at night, once they had gone to bed, he walked to the library. It was only 10 blocks, but felt longer in the dark. He moved fast, past silent houses and rusting mailboxes. At the library steps, he sat cross-legged near the entrance, just close enough to catch the public Wi-Fi signal. His old phone, screen cracked like ice, flickered to life. There was a scholarship he'd seen on the community board 2 weeks ago, a full ride to the Gracefield Academy of Arts funded anonymously, meant for students unseen by systems but heard by God. They asked for an essay, the theme, "I'm not the stains on my shirt." He had laughed when he saw it, not because it was funny, but because it felt like a dare. That week, he'd spilled orange juice on his only good shirt. Aunt April had slapped the back of his head and told him to go to school like that. Maybe it'll teach you a lesson. So that night, under flickering light, Elijah wrote, not for a grade, not for approval, but for himself. He wrote about being invisible in a house full of noise, about walking hallways where no one met his eyes, about the ache of wanting to belong, and the courage it takes to exist when every glance says you shouldn't. He ended the essay with a line that came from somewhere deep, not a quote on a magazine, but a truth carved through silence. "I am not what you see when you look away." He hit send just as the library lights shut off. Then he walked back home. The shoes rubbed blisters into his feet. He didn't mind. Some pain had purpose. And that night, Elijah finally understood something his father once said before the accident, a lesson half forgotten until it returned in a whisper. Sometimes, dignity is not what you wear, but how long you keep walking when no one offers to carry you. It had been an ordinary Thursday when the envelope arrived at the church office. Reverend Tomlin had just finished sorting donation slips and volunteer sign-up sheets when his secretary, Mrs. Langley, brought in a cream-colored envelope. There was no return address, only a handwritten line in black ink for the young man with the quiet eyes. Inside was a printed letter, crisp and formal, sealed with the insignia of the Gracefield Academy of Arts, a school known throughout Texas and beyond for cultivating writers, musicians, and thinkers. The kind of place parents dreamed their children might one day belong. The kind of place that rarely admitted students without legacy or wealth. But the letter said this: Elijah Carter has been selected as the recipient of our full academic and residential scholarship. His submission, "I am not the stains on my shirt," moved every member of our review board. It was raw, poetic, and undeniably honest. Please consider this letter an official award notification, made possible by an anonymous patron of the Gracefield Endowment, and deliver it to Mr. Carter as soon as possible. The Reverend didn't know who Elijah Carter was, not by name, but he remembered the boy with the torn shoes and the quiet voice who had stood at the front of the congregation just days before. The boy whose silence had said more than many sermons ever could. He made a few calls, he asked questions, most people shrugged, but the choir director remembered him. "He's April's nephew. Lives out past Preston Avenue," she said, lowering her voice. "Poor thing always looks like he's trying not to exist." The following Sunday, the church buzzed with the usual shuffle of hymns and heels. Aunt April arrived as she always did, dressed smartly, Kyle in tow, his hair perfectly sculpted. Elijah wore the same faded shirt, the same shoes with the unraveling tongue. He sat at the back again, trying to fold into the wooden pew. Midway through the service, Reverend Tomlin raised his hand. The music stopped. The congregation turned, waiting. "There is someone among us," he began, "whose name I only recently learned, though his presence has never gone unnoticed by heaven." The room hushed. "Elijah Carter, will you join me here at the altar?" Elijah's body went still. He didn't move, not even blink. Aunt April turned, eyes wide. Kyle snorted, loud enough to echo. "Elijah," the Reverend repeated gently. This time, he stood. But unlike before, there was no mockery in the air, no snickering behind hymn books, just silence. Curious, cautious, and for once clean. He reached the front. The Reverend smiled, not grandly, but like someone recognizing a miracle. "In this envelope," he said, holding it up, "is a letter from Gracefield Academy, a full scholarship, tuition, room, board, awarded to you, Elijah, for a piece of writing that has already changed the lives of those who read it." The words landed like thunder. Kyle's face paled. Aunt April's mouth dropped open, but she quickly reshaped it into a tight smile, as though the moment belonged to her. But Elijah stood still. He didn't take the envelope right away. He just looked down at his hands, chapped, ink-stained, calloused from floors scrubbed, meals served, laundry folded. He remembered the night he wrote it sitting outside the library, fingers shaking in the cold. He hadn't thought anyone would read it, let alone believe in it, let alone believe in him. When he finally reached for the letter, the Reverend placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't owe this to anyone but yourself," he said quietly. "Remember that." After the service, people began approaching him, shaking his hand, saying they always knew he was special, though none of them had ever spoken to him before. Aunt April stayed close, wrapping a possessive arm around his shoulder. "I always said he had potential," she chirped. "Raised him like my own, didn't I?" But the choir director gave her a look not cruel, not kind, just knowing. And behind them, Kyle kicked the baseboard of the pew, ignored by everyone for once. That week, Elijah met with a representative from the Children's Renewal Trust, a partner of the church. They offered him more than congratulations. They arranged for housing on the Gracefield campus, a mentor, books, supplies, clothes, a new start, and shoes. A proper pair, sturdy, clean, chosen just for him. But Elijah kept the old ones, wrapped in a paper bag under his bed. Because those shoes, for all their torn seams and rubber scars, had carried him through nights of silence, through shame, through sermons and slurs and sidewalks that never bent in his favor. They had carried him when no one else would. They were never broken. They were just honest, and maybe that's what dignity looked like, not perfection, but proof that you had been somewhere hard and walked through anyway. The church bulletin the next Sunday featured Elijah's name printed in neat serif font. "Local youth receives Gracefield Academy scholarship, a testament to faith, perseverance, and hidden gifts." It sat at the bottom corner of every hymnal, slipped into the hands of parishioners who now smiled wider at Elijah as he entered. Some even nodded, as though they had always seen his light. Others leaned in with polite curiosity, hungry for a piece of a story they had once ignored. But Aunt April wasn't smiling. Not really. Her pride wasn't the kind that glowed with warmth. It twisted instead into something tight and performative. When people congratulated her, she accepted the compliments as if she had written the essay, as if she had stayed up those nights. Barefoot outside a library for Wi-Fi. "I told you he was special," she repeated often, brushing imaginary lint from Elijah's shoulder. At home, she began referring to him differently, "Our Elijah," she'd say on the phone, her voice honeyed with claim. The chores she once demanded now came with backhanded comments like, "Don't forget who kept a roof over your head long enough for you to find success." Elijah said nothing. He never had to. The truth had already begun to speak for itself. Kyle, however, unraveled. At school, he sulked in the hallways, no longer the center of attention. Whispers followed him now, the kind that once shadowed Elijah. His friends teased him behind his back, mocking the fact that his cousin had won something real, something earned. And one afternoon during choir rehearsal, after making another joke about Elijah's sad puppy act, Kyle threw a crumpled music sheet at a younger student. He laughed. No one else did. The director watched from across the room. Kyle was suspended from the youth choir for a month. When Aunt April got the call, her voice was fire, but not at Kyle. At Elijah. "You think this is fair?" she snapped across the kitchen. "You get handed a scholarship and suddenly the world punishes Kyle. He's my son. He's the one who needs this choir. You don't even belong there." Elijah dried his hands on a dish towel, slowly, quietly, then walked back to his room without a word. That night, he packed. The departure to Gracefield came faster than expected. A staff member from the Children's Renewal Trust picked him up on a Thursday morning in a dark blue sedan. The ride was silent for the first half hour. Then the mentor beside him, a man named Marcus, asked if he was scared. Elijah didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel." Marcus nodded. "That's okay. You've been surviving for so long. Sometimes peace feels strange at first." They passed fields, brick schools, abandoned gas stations. Lubbock disappeared in the rearview mirror with its silences, its sideways glances, its expectations of failure. At Gracefield, Elijah was shown to a dorm with clean linens and a wooden desk by the window, a bookshelf with titles he recognized, a small wardrobe and a pair of black leather shoes in his exact size waiting at the foot of the bed. But he didn't put them on that day. Instead, he walked the campus in his old torn sneakers, still stitched at the sides, soles paper thin. Students stared, unsure what to make of him. Some whispered, one laughed. Elijah didn't flinch. He knew now whispers don't decide worth. A week later, he was invited to share the winning essay aloud in front of faculty and donors at a welcome ceremony. He didn't want to, but Marcus said gently, "Tell your truth not for applause, but because someone out there might still be hiding." Elijah stood before the polished podium, holding the printed page with trembling hands, but his voice, once afraid to rise above a whisper, now carried. He read every word, about the stains on his shirt, about being asked to clean rooms he wasn't welcome to sit in, about writing under a parking lot lamppost while others slept in comfort. He ended with this line, "I wore my bruises like they were borrowed, but I never gave them back. I turned them into footsteps." The room fell silent, not heavy, not pitiful, just reverent. And afterward, a professor pulled him aside. "You didn't just write an essay," she said. "You exposed a truth we often choose not to see. Because sometimes, the lessons people remember most don't come from those who were handed everything, but from those who built something with nothing and carried it like a story worth telling." Years passed. The shoes were long gone. Not because Elijah forgot them, but because they had finally fallen apart, threads unraveling, soles flapping open like tired mouths after too many miles. He'd held on to them longer than he should have, tucked them into a box at the back of his closet at Gracefield. But one day, after a difficult phone call with Aunt April, he let them go. It wasn't spite. It was surrender. To growth. To healing. Letting go of something doesn't mean it never mattered. It means you no longer need it to remind you of who you are. Gracefield became a beginning Elijah had never dared to dream. He studied literature, performance, and philosophy. He found mentors who challenged him gently. He came out publicly his second year, in a soft-spoken poem about silence and selfhood that drew tears in the back row. For the first time, his truth didn't feel dangerous, it felt freeing. And the boy who once folded himself into corners became a man who stood on stages. He published essays, spoke at schools, joined advocacy networks for queer youth in rural and conservative communities. But he never forgot the hush of that church pew, or the sound of his own footsteps across the marble floor when he was called out not to be shamed, but to be seen. It was that memory that brought him back to Lubbock, not for revenge, not for closure, but for something deeper. An invitation had come from Reverend Tomlin, older now, slower, but still with the same eyes that had once picked Elijah out of the shadows. "We're holding a youth revival," the letter said. "There are kids in this congregation who need to hear from someone like you, the same church, same pulpit." But this time, Elijah walked in through the front doors with a tailored jacket, a slim binder, and a quiet confidence that carried through the old stained glass like a new kind of gospel. He stood where he once trembled, and spoke not of punishment or pain, but of possibility. "I once stood here in torn shoes," Elijah said, scanning the faces before him. "And back then, many of you couldn't see past them. But I wasn't the shoes. I wasn't the silence. I wasn't the things people whispered when they thought I couldn't hear." He paused. His voice softened. "I was a story still being written." He told them about Gracefield, about the essay, about the mentor who told him that peace can feel foreign when all you've known is survival, and about the moment he realized he didn't have to apologize for existing. He didn't say Kyle's name. He didn't mention Aunt April. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked down at the front pew where a group of teens sat, watching with the same guarded curiosity he'd once worn like armor. "I don't know your pain," he said, "but I know what it means to be unseen. I know what it means to feel small in a room full of people who smile past you." Another pause. "But I also know what happens when one person, just one, decides to see you differently. Sometimes that's all it takes." When he stepped down, there was no applause, only stillness, thought, a few tears, and a standing hush that said more than noise ever could. Outside, a boy around 15 waited near the chapel steps. He wore a scuffed denim jacket, sleeves too long, and shoes clearly handed down. But his eyes met Elijah's directly. "Thank you," the boy said, not elaborating. Elijah nodded. They didn't need more words. Later that evening, alone in his car, Elijah opened his binder. Tucked behind his notes was a photo one someone had taken years ago at Gracefield. He was standing on stage, smiling, and on his feet, the last day he wore those shoes. They had been broken, but they had carried him. And sometimes, that's the story that deserves to be told, most not of the boy who had everything, but of the one who had nothing, except the courage to keep walking. Have you ever felt like someone judged you before hearing your story? Drop a comment below. Someone might need to read what you've been through. Subscribe to Heart Story for more true, powerful stories that deserve to be heard.